Am I to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Stephen Pfeiffer. He's a licensed and nationally board certified psychologist, author, speaker, and international parent coach. How many of you need a parent coach? I'll raise my hand. Sometimes I need a coach. So Dr. Pfeiffer has over 40 years of experience, and he is the emeritus and professor at Florida State University, and previously was professor of psychology at Duke University. He served as a clinical psychologist in the U.S. Navy Medical Service Corps and is considered one of the leading authorities on parenting and raising resilient and successful kids. So we're going to have a quick commercial, and then you're going to welcome Dr. Stephen Pfeiffer. Thank you, everyone.
Good evening, everyone. That's so awfully kind of you to clap even before my talk. I hope in 45 minutes you applause again. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm really delighted to have received the invitation to present to the audience, and I really need to applaud all of you for being here on a Tuesday evening. It really is impressive and very touching. It also is quite impressive to follow the choral presentation by the students. They were just really fantastic, and it really moves me every time I see young kids performing like that. At one time, I had young kids who are now adults, and now 5 grandchildren the ages of these kids, and it's just great to see them cooperating and performing as they are. So I was very touched by that. So I'm really happy to talk with you tonight about a subject that's near and dear to my heart. It's something that I've really dedicated the last 25, 30 years of my career as a professor and psychologist to develop, and I'm going to share with you this story. It's really a story that appears in a book that I very recently authored and published for parents. It's a story that's going to be told as a detective mystery adventure. So I hope you appreciate it, and I hope it helps as when you're driving home to think about what was it that that guy, Dr. Pfeiffer, was talking about. I'm going to keep it really simple because we don't have an awful lot of time together, but I'm going to try to focus on 3 key principles that have guided my work with families and children and adolescents over the years. Essentially, my research team and I, first at Duke University and then subsequently at Florida State University, we sought to try to uncover, find, if you will, super traits that will help kids to grow up to be successful young adults. And that's tonight's story. It's a detective story on how we sought to find these super traits. Okay, so the detective story begins here. It goes back a few years to 1980. I was a beginning assistant professor out at Arizona and I was very interested in multicultural and diversity issues at the time. And a colleague and I, Jack Naglieri and I, were invited by the Bureau of Indian Affairs to visit a Native American tribe at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, in fact. We had to hike a number of hours just to get to the Colorado River, where this very small tribe exists. And we were asked two things by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One, can you help us in identifying students who might have learning difficulties or attentional problems, or perhaps they might be gifted? And my colleague Jack Naglieri was an expert in that area, and that's what he focused on. So we hiked down the Grand Canyon, and he was carrying test kits with him. I was asked to focus on a slightly different issue. There had been a rash of suicides among older children and young adolescents in the Havasupai tribe, and this is a rather small tribe. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, can you meet with the families, can you meet with the kids, and try to figure out what we might be able to do to control the suicides that are occurring at the Havasupai tribe. Spent 2 years working with the Havasupai Native American population and learned a lot. And one of the important lessons that was really a first step in my detective story was to listen carefully to what parents and families shared with you. I had come in as a very young, recent graduate with a lot of book learning and academic learning, but I realized how naive and ill-prepared I was in working with a very unique and different culture than I grew up in. So that was my first lesson, sort of as a detective, in trying to uncover what we might be able to do to help raise successful kids. The detective story continues when my family and I moved from Arizona to New Orleans, and I became a pediatric psychologist in a large medical center. Ochsner Medical Center. And I had the good fortune of volunteering to work with the more senior clinical psychologist who was supervising my work. And he was as creative and innovative an educator as I've ever met. Back in 1984 and 85, he was perhaps the first person in the United States to focus on not the problems that kids with learning difficulties and hyperactivity have, but rather to focus on their strengths. And he ran a camp that he called Challenges, and rather than working on curriculum and interventions to deal with their deficits, of course, this is something important, but his orientation was what we call now a strength-based model. And it just opened my eyes to, wow, this may be a window into how we can help children by focusing on strengths rather than focusing on problems. So thank you, Dr. Andy Burker, for that early information that helped in my detective story. The detective story continues. I next moved from New Orleans to Durham, North Carolina, where I was a professor at Duke University. And I love sports, my kids played sports, so I volunteered to be sports psychologist for the Duke University soccer program. I was still focused in our research lab, in my clinical work, in my teaching, on trying to understand what might be the answers to helping kids who are struggling with problems. So building upon my work with the Havasupai Indian tribe and in New Orleans with youngsters with learning problems and attentional problems from a strength-based model, I started working with the Duke team. They were a great group of young women, incredibly talented, but they just weren't gelling as a team. And the coach said, "You're the shrink, work with them, help us to become a more successful winning team. And I spent a lot of time with these young women and with the coach, and I realized that they had enormous skill and ability in soccer. But what they were lacking, what they needed more emphasis, more strength on, was skills in social, emotional functioning. They needed to learn more about themselves and how they related to the other young women on the team if they were going to play as a unit. So that was my focus in working with them. Okay, so the detective story continues now at Duke University. I was, in the summer, headmaster for about 2,000 young children who came from really all over the United States, in fact, all over the world, to study in the summer with graduate students and professors on the campus of Duke University. So my job was headmaster of a very large summer program, a residential program. The kids came to and lived in the dorms. For many, it was the first time they left home. They were in highly challenging, highly enriched, exciting academic programs. And we started off by asking a few graduate students, would you be counselors for some of these kids who might have social, emotional, behavioral problems? And we had that going. And that was running real well. But I started thinking back to my days in Arizona and in New Orleans, and I realized, Steve, you're focusing on problems. You're not focusing on building strengths among these kids on campus. And we needed to focus on the problems when they occurred, and there were kids that did have problems, of course. In a population of about 2,000 youngsters in our summer programs, about 10% of the kids had serious problems, just like principals, teachers in the schools here have problems, serious problems. What about 10, 12% of the kids? But we found that many other kids, they didn't have problems. But as I observed them in the cafeteria and observed them in the dorm and in the social events, and was sneaking in the classrooms, I saw some of them just didn't seem to have joy on their face. Some of them, when I sat down with them, said, I don't have a friend here at Duke on campus. And it made me think, we need to build in strengths to enhance the development of these kids. Let's not worry about the problems. Let's take a strength-based approach and figure out how we can enhance these kids' functioning. So by the time we send them home at the end of their summer experience, they'll be stronger, more resilient than they were when they came. Let's not focus on the problems. Let's focus on the strengths. Okay, as you can tell, I'm not really good with this cue. I apologize. Okay, one more stop along the way in the detective story. I left Duke University. I was recruited to Florida State University as a professor and ended up working with a number of other universities and researchers in Florida in developing a pilot governor's school. We called it the Governor's School for Science and Space Technology, and we aligned with NASA and Kennedy Space Center. It was a great, marvelous program based on what I had done at Duke University. And again, I said, the NASA scientists can focus on what we call head strengths. We're not going to worry about their intellectual ability. We're not going to worry about their creativity. What we want to do is focus on how to enrich their lives spiritually. And we started devising programs for the students that we recruited from all over Florida that came to the campus of Kennedy Space Center and worked side by side with NASA scientists. And what we found is that some of the interventions that we experimented with made a real difference in the lives of these kids. And they said they went home much more fulfilled, much more enthusiastic than they had before. But this was a small program, and we said, can we expand it? Can we test it to see if it really works, some of our ideas in this strength-based model, we call it, for all kids across the country, and now it's being tested internationally. Initially, and this is sort of behind the curtain, I'll admit to this group, I made the mistake of betting on emotional intelligence. At the time, this, I'm sure you're all familiar with EI, or emotional intelligence. It's a very popular term. It was made popular around 2000, the year 2000. And I thought, this is what we're going to hang our hat on. Let's figure out how we can enhance the emotional intelligence of kids, starting in preschool through high school, and assess whether their lives are more enriched if we build their emotional intelligence. So for 4 years, my graduate students at Duke and then at Florida State did a lot of research with hundreds of kids, starting in Florida, but then we expanded across the country, testing whether emotional intelligence was the silver bullet. Was this the answer that would lead to kids who are more happy, resilient, well-adjusted? We looked at how emotional intelligence, or EI, related to important mental health outcomes, assuming that if we can build emotional intelligence among kids, their self-efficacy, or sense that they control their lives, will increase. Their self-esteem will rise. They'll be more resilient and able to cope with the difficulties that all kids, all adults encounter in life. We also looked at their sense of school belongingness and engagement and life satisfaction. Our, I would admit now, naive assumption was that emotional intelligence was going to be the answer to cure all the ills that all kids have in the United States, because we would see an increase in all of these outcomes: self-efficacy, self-esteem, belongingness, life satisfaction. Well, my students and I were wrong. We were rather reluctant to admit it, but we were wrong. Our research conclusively found that emotional intelligence was important. It's important, but it wasn't the totality of what we could do to raise healthy kids. And I won't bore you with the research findings here, but essentially what this shows is that emotional intelligence, when you can increase it in the home or in the classroom, it slightly improves on important life outcomes that all parents and teachers would agree they'd like to see, but only slightly. It was what we call an epiphany of aw shucks. Emotional intelligence is important, but it's not that important as a standalone, what we should be doing in the home and in the schools. So we expanded our search for other potential, what we call heart strengths, not head strengths, but heart strengths. I had to slip in, that's a picture of my 2 granddaughters there. Oh, bless their heart. Okay, and what we came upon over the next 10 to 12 years was that there were 3 what we call very powerful heart strengths that, when taken together, really make a difference in the lives of children across the country. And I'll be talking to you for a few minutes about these 3 heart strengths, or super traits we call them, because they really do play a huge role in the success of kids as they grow up and become young adults. Our research was based on lab studies that we did at Florida State University, former students of mine were professors now across the country, and they were documenting this in their universities at other states. And then colleagues internationally were doing studies testing these super traits just to see, do we really have an answer to how we can make life better for today's kids? Okay, so essentially, and I said I'd keep this very simple, we're talking about what we call strengths of the heart, or heart strengths, and what we found in our work, and this was corroborated or supported by colleagues around the globe, is that there are essentially 3 super traits that make a huge difference in kids' lives. Emotional intelligence is one piece of the puzzle, small piece, but important. But in addition, character strengths was the second piece of the puzzle. And the third piece was social skills. And after many, many, many studies, and then going out and field testing it, and then asking educators to apply it in the classroom, and asking parents to test it in the real world of their homes, what we found is that this triple package of super traits, heart strengths, emotional intelligence, character strengths, social skills, when put together, make a huge difference in the success of your child. So I'm excited to present it because it really does work. So emotional intelligence, I started off by saying that's what we first looked at. And what we found is it accounts for a little bit of the variance in predicting success, but not the totality. There are 4 elements to emotional intelligence. And as a parent, grandparent, teacher in the audience, you can think about, what is it that I do with my kid in the classroom or at home that might build these 4 components of emotional intelligence? The first thing is, does the child know their own emotions? Can they label and recognize how they're feeling? It's an important skill in emotional intelligence. The second component of emotional intelligence, sort of self-control, is can they manage emotionally heated situations? Third, can they recognize and read correctly what other people are feeling, the affective state, the emotions of peers, of teacher, principal, music director, soccer coach, whoever it might be? And fourth, can they handle emotional relationships? So these are the 4 components of emotional intelligence. The first take home, they're important. In my book, I talk about how as a parent, you can work on each of these 4 components in the home. And what we have found is that they do make a difference as kids grow up. But only one of the 3 pieces of the puzzle, emotional intelligence. Social skills, the second piece of the puzzle. Social skills, essentially, you're all familiar with, and you've demonstrated it many, many times, probably waiting when someone else pulled their car in front to park, or letting someone get in the aisle. They're important social interactive skills that we all need to learn starting at age 2 that help us to be effective in our social world. Extremely important in the child effectively communicating with others and being able to express their needs and their wants. Social skills speak to how kids make friends, how they maintain friendships, how they sustain friendships when there's disagreements or conflicts, how they develop healthy relationships starting in preschool all the way through high school and college, first job, and moving on to being independent of their parents. So social skills, very, very important. This is an example of one of the sheets that I use in working with parents in my clinical practice when we're working on building social skills. And what we have the parents do is, based on the age and the developmental level of the child, work on 2 to 3 social skills a week. Make it fun, reinforce it, teaching your child new social skills, building upon earlier ones. Okay, so we have emotional intelligence, first part of the puzzle. Second part, social skills. The third piece of the puzzle is what we call character strengths. Character strengths, unbelievably important in a strength-based model of building resilience and success in your child. From preschool through college and graduate school and in the workforce, character strengths make a real difference. Peterson and Seligman published this Bible of character strengths and virtues in 2004 that most of us researchers got super excited when we read about, and we started in our research lab doing studies, seeing, do character strengths make a difference in the lives of successful kids? Some illustrative character strengths that you're all familiar with: honesty, kindness, gratitude, humility, being humble, fairness, teamwork, going back to my Duke soccer game. So character strengths, very, very important. So the detective story came to a successful conclusion when we realized that these 3 super traits, if we can work with parents closely over an extended period of time, if we can work with teachers in the schools on monitoring, building, enhancing, reinforcing these 3 super traits, just like we focus on intellectual and academic and creativity skills, also very, very important. If we can work on these 3, what happens essentially is we find we have a new kind of kid, a kid who's resilient, a kid who's enthusiastic, a kid who's optimistic, a kid who's excited to take on challenges, a kid who's willing to help other children. And after presenting this to a number of audiences just like this, going back a couple of years, and I love sports, I was just talking about the early experience at Duke University with the soccer program, and someone says, I wonder if you could use a tennis analogy, or maybe pickleball now in Florida. It sounds like what you found is the sweet spot, that spot where kids have well-developed emotional intelligence, well-developed social skills, and pretty sharp character strengths. If they have those 3, it's kind of what we found to be a sweet spot. And we found these kids grow up to be very successful when they leave school and go on to be young adults. Okay, a few examples of how to cultivate heart strengths. My book goes into great detail. Each chapter talks about a different super trait and how in the home you can reinforce, encourage them. But here's just a few examples. Most of these examples I'll cite tonight come from the creative counseling work of Fritz Perls and Gestalt counseling, just because it's fun kind of stuff for parents to do with their kids. So reframing things. When your child is angry, upset, disappointed, reframing it in a positive way changes their thinking about their experience. Teaching your child slow, deep breathing when they're getting agitated, anxious, upset. It's sort of an Eastern meditative intervention that's very helpful for kids as young as preschool. Teaching kids to count to 5 when they're getting upset or angry before they say anything. Teaching kids positive self-talk Because what we find, going back to my Duke University women's soccer days, is when things got tough, the girls admitted, I sort of do negative self-talk. Well, we said, you're not going to be effective as a teammate, as someone who is part of a unit, if you're doing negative self-talk. So we teach parents how to encourage kids to demonstrate positive self-talk. Journaling. I do this with almost all the parents I work with. Keep a journal. It's a very powerful way to encourage these 3 super traits. The empty chair technique. At dinner, if your child is talking about how upset they are with an incident that occurred in school, pull one of the dining room or kitchen chairs and say, let's pretend that the child that you were having a fight with is sitting right here. Let's talk to that child. And after you let them talk it through, you say, great, let's do it again, but let's count to 5 and take 3 deep breaths, and now tell the child how you're feeling. Kids love this. It's a very easy way to teach these super skills. And use of metaphors. I teach parents how to use metaphors with their children. For example, a very often one, when I get referrals of parents whose kids are very aggressive, is we use the metaphor of your child is responding with their reptilian brain. We want them to use good thinking. And kids come and say, oh my God, my reptilian, my dinosaur brain's at it again. I got to stop. I got to count to 5 and take 3 deep breaths before I act. And we say, yeah, your reptilian or Tyrannosaurus brain got the best of you. Stop, don't say anything, think about how you might want to handle it differently. So these are a few examples of how parents can cultivate heart strengths. Before I conclude, what I've found in our work over 25 years is we designed all these elaborate, powerful, effective things that parents could do to enhance the resilience of their kids. But it was like another epiphany. It was another, oops, I made a mistake moment. I realized that we hadn't worked with the parents to enhance their functioning. And if we have all the best answers in the world for kids, but we don't help parents to learn to be more effective human beings, then they're not going to be great teachers and powerful role models for their children. So I wrote about what I call grandma's rules, because I had a grandma I loved, very conservative, traditional woman from Europe. She had very traditional, conservative views. And what I used over the years in my counseling work was ideas that grandma taught me and how to help parents to be more effective parents so that they can teach their kids these super traits. So here are just a few examples of my grandma's rules that I borrowed from her in growing up in Brooklyn and Bronx that I think make a huge difference when I work now with parents in teaching them about strengths of the heart. So reminding them that you gotta model good behavior. You need to model the behavior that you want your son or daughter to demonstrate. You need to be more in the present. You need to be more in the present. What does that mean? One example. I might go after this talk to a restaurant to grab something to eat, and I can bet that at least 50% of the tables will have people sitting there with their iPhone on, checking messages. It's just but one example of not being in the present. And what happens is that kids learn from what they observe their parents and their teachers doing. Not being in the present is something that kids learn. So when parents come to me and, they're nuts over, they can't control their kids watching video games and, on the computer up until all hours of the night, one of the things we talk about is you need to be a good role model for your kid. Are you always in the present moment? Is that something that you can work on and tell your son or daughter you're working on to demonstrate to them the importance of putting down the electronics? Third thing, Grandma's rule: learn to reduce the level of stress in your family, in your life, if you hope to teach your kids these 3 super traits. Identify the triggers that get you upset and work on controlling those. Embrace self-care. So these are examples of some of Grandma's rules that are in my book that we found are important to open the eyes of parents to, so that they can maximize being great teachers of strengths of the heart. Okay, so I said I would keep this simple. There's only really a few things that I've touched upon that I hope you can take away from today's talk. Heart strengths really optimize your child's development of resilience, life success, their well-being. It's what we call a prophylactic to prevent depression, anxiety, and all the social ills that we see hundreds of thousands of kids experiencing in the United States today. Second take home, you as a parent, as a grandparent, as a guardian, can teach these 3 super traits. They're all teachable. We have a lot of research we've published in scientific fancy journals showing that parents and teachers can teach these 3 super skills: emotional intelligence, social skills, character strengths. The caveat, though, it takes a lot of work. It's not a, once a month and you assume that things are going to change. It takes a commitment on the part of the family. It's important. And the last thing, Grandma's rules are important. You got to take care of yourself as an adult. If you hope to work with your son or daughter, your niece, your nephew, your grandchildren in teaching them these super skills, you need to, at the same time, put your life as a priority in taking care of yourself, so you're a role model for them in doing the right thing. Thank you very much. I appreciate you listening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pfeiffer. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
So I'm here to do some of the Q&A that we got in from parents and audience members through the QR code. A couple of questions came in several times. I want to say we got quite a bit of questions, so we might not be able to get to all of them, but I wanted to ask the ones that seemed to come up the most. So first question, I love the information shared. Sometimes I find after attending these talks, though, it's hard to actually make the changes at home. How easy is it for parents to implement these skills at home?
Great question. By analogy, if I was up here giving a talk, a brief talk on the importance of exercise, or if I was giving a brief talk to the audience on the importance of healthy nutrition in your life or your child's life, I would offer a couple of things, but my caveat would be it takes a lot of work. It's pretty easy to come up with an exercise program or a more nutritional, balanced way of eating, but by gosh, it takes an awful lot of work. It takes a huge commitment to keep up with the exercise, to keep up with eating healthy. The same is true in strengths of the heart. As you read in my book, really hardly any of the things are complicated or complex or difficult for parents to implement. But you need to say, hey, this is important for me and my wife and the family, so we're going to spend 3 evenings a week, because it's that important, even if it's just 20 minutes working on it. Because if we don't commit to giving it a full effort, it's not going to be any more successful than a diet fad that you stay on for a week or two and then you go back to eating the way. So it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort. It's not complicated, but if what I shared with you today makes some sense and resonates in thinking about how I can help my child become more resilient, happier, more successful, getting along better with others, if those are important outcomes, then it takes a commitment of a couple days a week as a parent working on these things.
Thank you. That makes sense. I really like this next question because I really enjoyed your focus on developing strengths rather than maybe just correcting misbehaviors. And so this question kind of is in line with that. It says, in my home, we focus more on making sure our children get good grades and follow rules. If we switch to focusing more on strengths of the heart, will that guarantee better success outcomes?
Good question. Really good question. I tend to be, I was as a dad, as a parent, conservative. My wife's here, she would nod her head, yeah, he was. I grew up in a conservative family. I was in the military for 7 years, so I tend to believe in rules and structure. They're important, I feel, for humans. So I don't think it's an either or. I think the parent that wrote this, I would say, you're doing the right thing. Encouraging your child to work hard, to try to get good grades, to be respectful of the teacher and other students, to try to learn as much as you can and get excited about learning and being creative. That's all important. In addition, to be a complete person focusing on heart strengths rounds out the goal that parents have in nurturing resilience. So it's not an either or. I think what that parent is saying makes sense, but in addition, you can work on these heart strengths as well.
Great. I think hopefully we have time for one more question. How can I better engage with my teenager when they are completely consumed by social media and video games on their phone?
Okay. Great question. Not an uncommon question that I get in my clinical practice. There's not an easy answer for that one. Really, it harkens back to you as a parent need to be comfortable setting rules and limits on what your child can appropriately do. The American Academy of Pediatrics recently came out with a statement that we should limit children and adolescents watching of video games, being on the internet, to no more than 90 minutes a night. That's a lot of time, but for many, many parents, they say, yeah, I wish I could get it down to 90 minutes. My kid's doing 3, 4, 5 hours. I hear this a lot. And I do a lot of international work, and I hear this from parents in Europe, in Asia, and South America. So it's not unique to the United States. This is a problem. My early work as a clinical psychologist in the Navy, in fact, out in California, was working in an alcohol rehab center. I was the clinical psychologist in a medical center in California. And I became very attuned to addiction and how pernicious and difficult it is when someone becomes addicted to something, such as I happen to be working with alcohol, but really for many, many, many teens, adolescents, and even for kids who are pre-adolescent, the addiction of the digital world is every much just like a chemical addiction. It operates the same way neurophysiologically. So we need to recognize this is a problem. We need to be comfortable sitting down and explaining to our youngster, it's a problem, but I'm going to work with you and help you on it to cut back. I'm not asking you to go cold turkey, but you got to set some limits and to be able to explain to them why spending an inordinate amount of time on any one thing is taking their time away from a more balanced life. So it's not, I'm not giving an easy answer because it's not an easy problem. This is a problem that tens of thousands of parents around the globe are dealing with. It is a challenge, but if you stick with it, you can be successful in helping your child to learn to limit their intake of the digital arena.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pfeiffer, and I think we are probably ready.
Thank you.